Africa must be free. I like to say that every once in a while to remind myself to root myself in the conversation that I like to start from when I talk about the danger of NATO, because I think that very often when we anti imperialists talk about the danger of NATO, not frequently enough, I think, do we talk about the threat that NATO poses to freedom loving peoples on the continent of Africa come up. So I'm very honored to broach this topic in collaboration with the threat that NATO poses to all freedom loving people around the world. Now, I'm sure that most people who are watching know, but just in case some people do not know, NATO was founded in 1949 after World War II at a time when African countries were still being colonized by some European nations. NATO was formed under the guise of being a collective defense against the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, the very scary communism, the mortal enemy of capitalism. That's why communism anywhere is treated as a threat by capitalist countries everywhere. And NATO was formed with a requirement that any attack on one of the member states is considered an attack on the entire collective. Therefore, collective action from NATO is required. And I hope that our viewers also know, but if you didn't, I'm going to tell you, that the United States formed this alliance, NATO, not only with some of the former so-called enemies of the US and the Allied forces in World War II, even though I do like to constantly remind people that it was the Soviet Red Army that actually defeated Nazi Germany, but that's a different conversation. But NATO was formed by the United States with the Axis powers, AKA the fascists, Germany, Japan, and Italy. But the US also extended a warm welcome to Africa's principal colonizers, like the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, and Belgium. So, right from its beginning, NATO as a formation was clearly deeply embedded with fascism and colonialism, which in my mind are like cousins of dominations, if you cousins of domination, if you will. And this, in my mind, makes NATO from its very inception not a collegial group of European nations looking out for each other's interests against the big bad communism of the Soviet Union and its allies, but NATO was always a collaboration among the different facets of fascism, capitalism, totalitarianism, colonialism, whichever one you want to pick. Those were the countries that were making up NATO to create the imperialist international gang of thugs controlled by the United States that is NATO today. But if NATO was founded to allegedly counter Soviet aggression and stop the spread of communism, then when the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1991, then NATO logic would or should have followed would cease to exist, right? No, not so much. Instead, NATO has done the exact opposite. It's expanded from the founding of those 12 member states to, at present, 30 member states, many of whom are Eastern European countries, former Soviet republics, and Warsaw Pact allies that were scooped up into NATO after the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the implementing of neoliberal Western capitalism in those countries. So, what is NATO's role then, especially since they ain't never stayed minding their own business of countries only in the North Atlantic? The US government and those of its allies will claim that they're fighting communism still. They still claim this, especially now with the US EU NATO proxy war cooked up in Ukraine. But truthfully, NATO is the primary axle in the wheel of the military industrial complex controlled by the US empire for the sole purpose of carrying out this government's full spectrum's dominance of the world, all driven by the ferocious and unending appetite of corporate capitalist dictatorship. And what is that if that is not the new manifest destiny? The centrality of Africa in the US and NATO's pursuit of this new manifest destiny is very important because NATO was not only a safe haven for colonial powers to find ideological and political support while they were colonizing the continent in right up to the 1970s, but those countries received military support from NATO members to help them attempt to put down rebellions against colonialism. For example, and these are just a few, during the 1950s, the colonial nations that were now members of NATO installed military bases in their colonies, aiming their weaponry gifted to them by the generous warmongering entity of NATO at Russia and at liberation struggles against those colonial powers on the continent. Way back in 1967, Kwame Nkrumah said in his book Challenge of the Congo that there were at least 17 air bases, 9 foreign naval bases, 3 rocket sites, and an atomic testing range operated by NATO in North Africa. That was in 67. It's a lot more now. In addition to military missions in about a dozen African countries, not to mention the exploitation of raw materials for the production of nuclear weapons occurring in the mines of Congo, Angola, South Africa, and then called Rhodesia. Amilcar Cabral pointed out that Portugal, the most underdeveloped country in Western Europe at the time, could only be able to wage 3 colonial wars in Africa because they had military support from NATO planes and bombs. And they still lost, by the way. So I don't want to hear any more about how we cannot defeat this behemoth. It is possible, people. But it's not just military support that NATO provides, it's also ideological warfare, as Nkrumah also pointed out in his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, where the many types of mechanisms that NATO uses to defend the neocolonial project on the continent, ranging from economic, political, religious, ideological, and cultural spheres. To do this, NATO worked with other mechanisms of imperialism, like the CIA back then, but today that would translate to the National Endowment for Democracy, or USAID, which have played crucial roles in coups on the continent, even against Nkrumah himself and all over the world. But NATO gained some of its cover for its dastardly and deadly activities in Africa through the establishment of AFRICOM. The US European Command, or EUCOM, was a central part of NATO, it still is, and it was originally responsible for 42 African states. How does the military of one country become responsible for entire countries on another continent? Only imperialists know this magic. We can't, this is not humanity at work here. But I guess that was too much. Oh, so sorry. I guess that was too much for the former commander of EUCOM and the former commander of NATO's operational forces, who was James L. Jones Jr., at the time when he proposed in 2007 the establishment of AFRICOM to handle the Africans for the US and NATO. So AFRICOM is literally, the US Africa Command is literally the progeny of the United States military and NATO. And from its inception, people on the continent opposed AFRICOM's establishment, with the people in Nigeria taken to the streets to protest headquartering AFRICOM in their country, which is why it's headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany today. And the so-called war on terror, which has really been a war on Muslims and other Black and brown, working class, poor, and colonized and oppressed people around the world who had the nerve to oppose US and NATO interference in their countries, that's actually served to increase terrorism around the world over 1,000%, because the US delivers terror through drone bombings and other murderous operations under the guise of fighting terrorism, very often through NATO. But they kill hundreds of thousands of civilians instead and displaces untold millions more. The US, NATO, and AFRICOM have a blood-soaked legacy that they are dragging around the world. And we can look to what they've done, the US, NATO, or AFRICOM, in places like Libya in 2011, Somalia in 1993, Biden's continued bombing and troop deployment in Somalia today, their continued efforts, NATO's continued efforts to allegedly counter so-called high seas piracy around the coast of Somalia, NATO's and AFRICOM's continued training of militaries directed by comprador leaders in African nations that are unleashed on the people rising up against their repressive and exploitative policies, the continued reliance on neocolonial proxies in African nations like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda to steal the country's resources and suppress the people rising up against them. The through line from the US to NATO to AFRICOM to the ongoing exploitation and repression of African people and the theft of their resources for capitalist dictatorship and profit is clear. And it's a line that must be stopped from advancing any further. And additionally, we in the Black Alliance for Peace say that this clear line of US NATO imperialism must not just be stopped in Africa, it must be stopped also in Haiti, as the US is preparing yet another multinational rapid action force, also known as NATO, to once again invade and illegally occupy Haiti. We in the Black Alliance for Peace emphatically oppose the continued US gangsterism toward our Haitian brothers and sisters, continuing to struggle against Western powers that are just punishing them for daring to defeat their slave system and free themselves. And we oppose that, what's going on in Haiti, as much as we oppose the very existence of AFRICOM and demand that it be shut down. So in closing, this is why the Black Alliance for Peace is embarking upon a month of action against AFRICOM. And in this month, this clear line from the US to fascism, to colonial powers, to NATO, to AFRICOM is raised in connection with the struggles of the people on the continent of Africa, struggling against neocolonialism, the people in Haiti, struggling still to be truly free from imperialism through crushing IMF loans and US selected puppet leaders who allow the exploitation of the people for Western corporate greed, and to the people right here in the US living in the domestic colonies, fighting for healthcare, housing, education, union representation on their jobs, and more, all against the same capitalist dictatorship that propped up NATO in the first place. So if you'll permit me, I'll share some links to our month of action against AFRICOM with you in the chat, because there's still time for you to get involved and get connected. We welcome your solidarity and would love to be in solidarity with you in our shared struggles. And I leave you with something we say in the Black Alliance for Peace: not one drop of blood of the working class and poor to defend capitalist dictatorship, no compromise, no retreat.